Hello, I'm Jeremy Clegg, President of the Academy of International Business. Welcome to this webinar on investment in sustainable recovery. Let me say a little about the importance of this topic. There is a realization by governments, international organizations, multinational firms, academic researchers also, that the post-pandemic world offers a rare opportunity to reset our priorities. Cherished arguments that change in ways of working is impossible or impractical, that behaviors cannot be radically improved, and pro-social investment at scale is unthinkable, have been smashed. Finally, we realize that we are truly one world. Layer this on top of the pre-pandemic rash of nationalism, populism, and protectionism, and we can see that our future is all to play for. In our sessions today, we can only point to the scope for change and the initiatives that will make investment for sustainable recovery a reality. Our purpose is that starting now, we will need academic researchers to join forces with the policy community so that the right choices are made. Today's event establishes a new partnership between the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development and the Academy of International Business. Now, UNCTAD was created to give voice to the developing economies of the world within the United Nations. Its work has undergone a paradigm shift since the global financial crisis, from a focus on freedom of investment to investment for sustainable development. AIB has added to its pure scientific research a new emphasis on applying its knowledge to the real world to have an impact. This has been marked by the birth of the AIB's Journal of International Business Policy, which joins UNCTAD's long-standing Transnational Corporations Journal as a forum for scientific research dedicated to policy. Put our academy together with UNCTAD, and we can see that it is the perfect partnership to serve the big questions around how international business can deliver sustainable recovery. I should like to thank all of those who have done the real work to bring us this webinar today. Amelia Santos Paulino, Chief of the Investment Issues Section, Division on Investment and Enterprise at UNCTAD, and Ari Van Ash, Professor in the Department of International Business at HEC Montreal, probably better known to you as the Deputy Editor of the AIB's Journal of International Business Policy. And our moderator in this first of two sessions is Richard Bollwein, Head of Investment Research in the Division on Investment and Enterprise at UNCTAD. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. James Jan. James has been Director of the Investment and Enterprise Division at UNCTAD since 2009, and he leads the preparation of the World Investment Report, acting in effect as its editor-in-chief. Since taking up this role, James has dedicated himself and the work of his division to investment for sustainable development, and he has led the paradigm shift that I referred to. Not surprisingly, the topic for this webinar is a suggestion by James as we started discussing the topic just 2 months ago. So thank you very much all. Have a wonderful session and a wonderful day. I hand over now to James.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Thank you very much for the general introduction. And also I would add my voice to express the appreciation of UNCTAD to you under your leadership of the AIB as the president, and also to the drivers behind, in front of the sea, leading this process, that is Tonga and Ari. And Jeremy, you have already highlighted the objectives, the content, the format of this AIB-UNCTAD joint webinar. So I will leave my remarks on the collaboration between AIB and UNCTAD for the closing remarks when I chart the way forward beyond the seminar in terms of our collaboration. I would like to use my 5 minutes to share with you my perspective, the future of a global investment in development, the mega drivers, directions, and a fresh research and policy agenda for the 2020s. I will highlight 5 driving forces that will shape the future structure of global value chain and the landscape of trade and investment, and each in 5 general directions. And I will then put forward a policy agenda for investment in sustainable development and inclusive growth. And this is a package of 5 core investment policy areas, plus 20 grand questions that, that Peter Buckley used to call it. I hope that this provides a framework for future research and policy analysis and interaction between academic and the policy practitioners. The first 5 driving forces, Jeremy alluded to some of them. The first I see is the economic governance realignment. The international trade and investment and policymaking is shifting away from multilateral cooperation towards regional and bilateral solutions, with intensified protectionism at home. And this aggravated competition between economic powers in trade, investment, technology, and it may lead to a kind of widespread global systemic divide in economic governance. The second mega driver is the new industrial revolution, the robotic enabled automation, enhanced supply chain digitalization, Internet of Things, additive manufacturing. All these will stimulate new cross-border investment in new business sectors and through new modes of operations. And the third is the sustainability imperatives, particularly driven by the SDGs, which I don't have to elaborate because the panelists will talk about that. The fourth is the corporate accountability, the global efforts to fight corruption, illicit payments, tax evasion, and anti-competitive practices, as well as the ESG standards will fundamentally change the modes of operation of multinational companies and their governance. And the fifth is reliance-oriented restructuring of the global value chain and the landscape of the trade and investment. And the massive pandemic disruptions and aggravated geopolitical rivalry will definitely drive the multinationals to diversify and reshoring or nearshoring their GVCs, that to be more shock resistant and less resilient on foreign sources, less reliance on foreign sources, sorry. And these driving forces are both endogenous and exogenous of the multinationals and their international production system. And their effects on global investment are multifaceted, and they are sometimes mutually reinforcing and sometimes pushing in opposite directions. They play out differently across industries and geographies, and combined, these driving forces will impact 3 sets of location determinants that we used to talk about. The host countries, that is, the policies and regulatory framework for international investment, the characteristics and dynamics of the host country, and the investment facilitation and infrastructure. And all these will lead to kind of new directions of the international operations, international system, and roughly there can be a kind of impact on the restructuring of the global value chain or international production system. There are 5 of them as I see it. First, the more regional and the less global value chains, the less fragmented manufacturing GVCs, and the more concentrated value added, the more platform-driven governance and asset-light value chains, and growing services sharing in value chains and offshoring. And finally, the resilience and the national security-driven GVC diversification. This will lead kind of a recovery of global FDI in a couple of years ahead. And the driving forces will also impact on global trade and FDI in 5 possible directions, and these are all hypotheses. First is the decline of global efficient-seeking FDI, an increase in regional market-seeking FDI, the downward pressure on trade in intermediate goods, and the less on trade in final products, and a shift from mass production to mass customization, a growing FDI in infrastructure and public services, as well as a boost for FDI in green and the blue economies driven by SDG drive, SICs. So these are kind of possible 10 directions for transformation of international production system and the landscape of international investment. So all these can serve as a kind of forward-looking research agenda for international business scholars and scholars in adjacent disciplines, such as international finance economics, international investment law, and investment and development studies. Each of these trends merits more in-depth research and shape and perhaps necessitates new theory. And furthermore, the 5 driving forces and 10 trends can also present a long list of topical issues for evidence-based policy analysis in the coming decades. And I see 3 dimensions of the policy analysis agenda. First, the investment policy core, that priorities for policy actions. Second, policy implications for the 5 driving forces, that is what we call the key emerging trade and investment issues. And the third, which is the core topic of today, that international investment and global value and global crises, the challenge for building back better. And I don't think I have the time to elaborate on all these policy issues, just to highlight a few. First, what we need is to research on how to update investment development policy framework, including effective interface between industrial development strategies and investment policy instruments. Second, how to boost investment in SDGs in the process of global recovery. And third, how to reform the international investment treaty regime in the absence of a multilateral investment system. And the current one consists of multi-layered, multifaceted 2,500 investment treaties, and altogether there are 3,500. And the fourth is to strengthen multilateralism in investment. And this is very important for the way forward. I've identified 20 key big questions related to the challenges in an article that is organized by Sarena and Ari in the GIBP, and it's a collection talking about the research agenda in the future. So all these lead to a kind of immediate question that is today at the international investment and global crisis, the challenge for building back better. The world has witnessed at least one major global crisis per decade and a myriad of smaller ones in between. So many more will come. And it is imperative to learn the lessons from the past and current major crises for future business strategies and policy response. So among the key questions is what types of strategies and the policy measures are required to restart an engine of international production for economic recovery and reconstruction. The second, for lessons learned, how do crises impact on global investment flows, and how do MNEs react in global crises and to the massive policy interventions? The third, how to promote investment in building back better towards resilience and sustainable economy. And all these will present challenges and opportunities for firms and states alike, leading to an investment development paradigm shift. Thank you very much. And I would pass on to Richard to moderate the session, the first session of this webinar. Richard?
Thank you, James.
To you now.
Thank you, James. Thanks for this introduction. It's a great honor for me to moderate this morning's session. I'm very happy to welcome some very eminent speakers this morning. The topic of investing in sustainable recovery, we're very busy exploring this in our division at the moment, of course, in the preparatory work we're doing for the World Investment Report. So this discussion will be instrumental also for us. We have 4 speakers in the morning session that all are collaborators used to working with us or currently working with us and helping us in our research work in UNCTAD. Some of them, some speakers with a long history, and some speakers recently joining us and supporting us in our current research for WIR. So very happy to introduce everyone. I would characterize this morning's session as about priorities and challenges in investment for sustainable recovery. And we're going to have as a first speaker, Sarianna London, who is going to talk about one of the key priority areas that features in all of the rescue and recovery plans and investment plans post-pandemic, which is the energy transition. We will have Professor Rob van Tulder as the next speaker with what I consider to be more the business perspective on investment priorities and the need for businesses to start operating in a different way. We'll have Professor Andres Rodriguez-Pose talking more, rather than the business perspective, the development and state perspective on this, and how what would be the investment priorities and challenges for industrial development in the post-pandemic world. And as the final speaker of the morning sessions, we have Jacob Molnar, who will give the finance perspective. So we have priority areas, business perspective, development perspective, finance perspective. And I think that gives a very nice combination this morning, a nice overview of what we need as priorities and challenges for investment in the sustainable recovery. I will pass the floor to each speaker individually, and I would ask the audience to use the Q&A panel during the presentations or after to pose any questions you like, which I will then use afterwards to structure the discussion after the presentation. Of course, the discussion will be opened by two discussants that we have, who will speak first and comment on our main presentations, which is Ms. Shasha Zhao and Pavida Pananant, who will open the floor for our discussion. So without further ado, let me pass the floor to Sarianna London with the first presentation this morning. Sarianna, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Richard. Now I will stop your screen sharing. I'm grabbing the screen from you. Thank you very much. So it's my job to get us off to a good start. So we start with the sustainable recovery and the energy transition. Now, what do we mean by the energy transition? What we basically mean in the first instance is a huge increase in the importance of electricity in the energy consumption in the world as a whole. So here you see a very mainstream prediction of where we will be, where we are today, where electricity accounts for about a fifth of all the energy that is used, and the prediction for 2050, where it will account for a half. And even more importantly, about 86%, so, but let's say most of that electricity should then be renewable energy. And so when we say the challenges of the energy transition, this is largely the transition that we are talking about. Now, my entry, and both Richard and James have already mentioned, of course, that behind this transition, there is a lot of public policy at the national level, and of course, at the international level. In Europe, we have the European Green Deal, which was already in development before, but which has now received a boost from the financing, indeed, for sustainable recovery from the pandemic. My interest in this area started about 3 years ago, specifically in the energy sector, where we started to do some work on foreign direct investment in renewables. And the question that interests us was that since we are seeing this massive shift towards electrification and renewable energy in that area, what role does foreign direct investment play in that area? And we are specifically interested in the electric utilities, so not in this case talking about what will happen with the oil and gas companies. Now, it turns out that foreign direct investment in this area is not a fringe phenomenon. So In fact, in the last few years, the world has seen an increasing amount of greenfield investment, particularly in the solar and wind areas. And this is quite important because, of course, the transition in real terms means that more of the generating capacity that is invested in today needs to be renewable than non-renewable. I should remark that it is still commonplace in this sector for investments to be made also in non-renewable sources of energy. But of course, increasingly for the transition to take place, what we would need to see is that the old legacy assets that are non-renewable will gradually fade away and they will be replaced by renewable assets. Now, what we found in this particular research is that there is quite an important group of private firms. They are all private today, although some of them have a history of state ownership previously, who are really the pioneers in this sector. They are firms that have been early in investing in renewables and converting their sources of energy to renewables. And today they act as foreign direct investors doing projects all around the world. And this is quite interesting and maybe even a little bit surprising because the energy sector is not a sector, and certainly electric utilities in that sector are not among the most common foreign investors that we think of. And we feel that this group of firms is quite vital to meet the challenges of the energy transition and the green recovery, because they can act as catalysts for getting off investment projects in renewables and running these as part of the normal electricity infrastructure. Importantly, there are some mixed cases in the data as well, where, as we said, firms, even some of the firms that are quite actively investing in renewables, are also investing in legacy assets. And this is one of those areas where we need to understand a little bit better what is going on. We also looked at the issue of incentives, which is important from a policy point of view. And while it's quite clear from the history of the sector that these have played a role in the development of these pioneering private firms, today, when we look at where their new investments are oriented, incentives seem to play a very small role in those investments. The incentives were mainly attractive to state-owned enterprises who were much more conservative in their investments anyway, so they kind of invested in countries where they knew the environment and could easily, mostly cross borders, or something like from Austria to Germany. So that's what we found in the electric utility sector. But that then led us to probe further in the energy transition, because of course there are sectors that are difficult to electrify. Not everything will be electric in the future, and some very important sectors are difficult to electrify. And these include two sectors that we are studying at the moment, aviation and shipping. And they also include things like large iron and steel mills and heavy transport over roads. In this area, one of the most prominent solutions that has been proposed is the use of hydrogen. And hydrogen can be used in multiple different ways. It can be used directly, or it can be used in combination with carbon, which can be harvested by CO2 capture, so it's green, and made into synthetic fuels. What I want to say with this picture is that there are multiple pathways for reaching or converting these sectors into renewable energy. In many cases, there is no one solution for these sectors, but multiple solutions have to be explored alongside each other. And some of the developments in this area are really quite staggering. So here I have a couple of pictures. This is only an imagined thing. It doesn't exist yet, but this is a so-called energy island. And here we have another one, which is actually the Danish government has announced that it does plan to build this kind of energy island in the North Sea. Both are based on the same principle, that you use renewable energy to get hydrogen, and then you use that hydrogen to fuel, for instance, ocean-going ships without needing to rebuild infrastructure for the ports, for example. Now, to me, these two examples are just exemplary of the kinds of changes that we have to undergo as part of this transition. And when I ask myself, what is different now about the sector? Why are these energy transition risks, are they different from other risks? Then I would say, yes, they are different, first of all, because they are systemic. Now, there are other systemic risks as well, but there are multiple systems that typically are involved. So different kinds of energy solutions that will be simultaneously applied to some of these sectors, which creates much more complexity. Furthermore, there is a temporal dimension, and this is very prominent because we do face kind of a natural deadline, which is our realization of the effects of climate change. But we also have policy pledges by the EU for 2050, by China, I think, for 2060. Finland, actually, where I am doing this work together with colleagues at Aalto, has declared a goal of carbon neutrality by 2035. When we talk about infrastructure investments, this is a very short time span, and we are really talking real life things happening almost month by month that will need to be, decisions will need to be taken to get us to that point. The timelines are very challenging because on one hand, we have capital investment cycles that are quite long in the energy industry. On the other hand, we have this temporal pressure that is putting more and more emphasis on making decisions now, irrespective of the fact that we have lots of legacy assets out there. There is a silver lining to that, which is that in emerging markets, where you are building new capacity to meet new demand, this is less of a constraint and the renewables can really play an active role. Overall, and from the point of view of research, what I see as the critical issue is that this really requires a next level, call it 2.0 or 4.0, whatever it is, business government collaboration, because there is truly a need to use the technological capabilities of the private sector, the equipment providers, the companies that provide the engines for the ships, the companies that build the power plants, and incorporate that in the decision-making of the governments who have to, on a very short time span, arrive with viable pathways and commitments to build this infrastructure. I think this is challenging in the developed world because it calls for a joint language about these risks, about understanding their impact, and it requires a lot of trust between the players. In emerging markets, some of these things are hampered probably by some issues of distrust of governments, of their ability to commit to these kinds of processes, which is something that we have seen before. And then on top of that, we have the temporal pressure. And the final thing that I would throw in the mix is that I have something of a fear, and I hope that I will be proven wrong, that since we are pushing for the green transition simultaneously in many parts of the world, we may not have enough of these catalytic private actors at one time to actually engage in these projects. This is a problem that will solve itself over time, but I fear that there may be some investment bottlenecks there as well. That is it for my remarks. If I'm allowed one final remark, that is that the comments by James Chan, where he referred to the paper is actually available online at the Journal of International Business Policy if you're interested in looking at it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarjana. Very interesting. And clearly, as we can see from all of the recovery packages that are being defined in Europe that you mentioned, but also in the plans for the recently defined US packages, this is a top priority area, and so is it. It's also a priority as far as we can see, in some of the packages that have been defined already by major emerging markets. That everyone is putting this top of the list for investment priorities. So it's an important area to explore further. With that, let me pass the floor to Rob van Tulder to give us a different perspective on the behavior, looking at the behavior of firms in this process. Rob, over to you.
Thank you, Richard. I am going to share my slides with you all, also to give you an idea. There's so much more to be told about this, but anyway, Thanks also for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here also in this STEAM panel, and always happy also to support the joint efforts of AIB and UNCTAD to get some work done. For me today, I wanted to talk about the NEXUS challenge also, because I think this is where I think also a lot of collective intelligence need to be built up, and we can do that. And there are some good reasons for that. So let me guide you through this. So for me, the coronavirus crisis actually is yet another stress test for the world. And I just show here the book of Timothy Geithner, written on the basis of the 2007-2008 financial crisis, after which, of course, also policy measures have been taken to do a stress test for banks. For me, the stress test now with Corona is about business models in general. And it's about the resilience of the business model. This is about what does just-in-time inventories mean? What does global value chains, what does it mean? How do we look at shareholder capitalism? What about the plea for self-regulation in all areas of society? Privatization, limits to open economies, maybe? Platform economy, what does it mean? Well, to what extent also are business models like fast food or fast fashion, are they actually the ones that we want? These are the big questions that we can put on the agenda, which I think are really important also, not only to relate to policy measures, but also to, say, business model. And I'm looking at this from the business model perspective. But maybe just show you this. Actually, the antidote against the coronavirus has already been created. I call that a hybrid governance model. The SDGs, and I hope that everybody knows about the background, 2015, it is a integrated agenda, which by accident I'm really happy that in 2015 it appeared. It wasn't that obvious that it would be sort of the successor of the Millennium Development Goals, that in some respect were successful, in some respect were not successful. So I would consider this a very interesting hybrid governance model that not only looks at issues like climate change and poverty from a negative point of view, but also from a positive investment point of view. And I quote here Guterres, in response also to the coronavirus, had we been further advanced in meeting the SDGs, we would be better able to face this challenge. So why would we be better able to face the challenge? And I'm not going to say that the SDGs are a perfect model, on the contrary, but it is something about also, and I just refer also to the work that I've been doing on how to trigger an investment agenda of companies, governments, and civil society and citizens at the same time. So that is where a positive frame or a common goal is important. Actually, companies have supported this from the basics also, from the 2015 onwards. 95% of all the big multinationals in the world said this is a big investment opportunity. The race to the top is not something that we have to develop in order to prevent a race for the bottom, but actually it is just supporting the race to the top, which then considers a $12 trillion annual investment opportunity. It is about investing in future markets, not in present markets. So as a business professor, I very often say, well, actually the SDG agenda presents companies with an entrepreneurial spirit, much more than the old way of looking at issues like sustainability as, well, we have to prevent poverty from appearing. Of course, the big question is then, of course, why? What are companies doing? So this is just some recent reports, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, but also the UN, the Sustainable Development Report, and very recently also the Global Compact, trying to figure out what's happening. So what's happening? It's not a lack of embracing the SDGs. Actually, there is sufficient support, but there is a problem. And called the bottleneck is, it is engagement and ownership as a part of the core business of companies. And also, there's some cherry picking going on. It's a relatively superficial embracement of the SDGs. And I call that the no nexus, and I will come back to that in a second. It's also a lack of understanding of the business case, because to be honest, I'm utterly disappointed by the entrepreneurial spirit of many companies in the world that look at issues of investment as a bureaucratic issue, as risk management, as limiting liabilities and the like. So this is a very dominant, also prevalent idea in international business. So how to get out of this, which I then call the business case. Is there a business case? Like Sariano also referred to, there's clearly a business case for electricity, but how to organize it. So that also means how to integrate the SDGs in your corporate strategies. And I would add to this, it is also a lack of understanding how to partner, how to organize new ways. And I call it also hybrid governance, not at the policy level, but also at the business level. So what does COVID show us? Actually, this is a picture that UNDESA immediately after the COVID crisis showed. Actually, it is about the NEXUS challenge. You look at COVID, at the pandemic, and immediately you can see they're linked to all sorts of other issues. Actually, it's not a health crisis only, it is a systems crisis, and it has repercussions for poverty, hunger, everything else. So for me, the SDG agenda is also a very interesting way of collecting information. I call that collective intelligence on a global scale, which to a large extent has been unprecedented, partly also by UNCTAD, the OECD, the World Bank, all what we are called the custodian agencies, bringing together information and knowledge, trying to harmonize that. It creates a context in which companies can also look at this. Now, this is, say, the crisis and then what it means for the rest of the world. But actually, I would turn it around. So you can see the paper that we just published in the Journal of International Business Policy, call it Beyond COVID. They say, okay, we have a nexus, meaning we have a cause consequence. That's the upper level. We can easily map also the consequences of COVID. But we can also turn it around. And I use that as, I call that the nexus in terms of corporate interventions. So what normally would look like a health crisis that, of course, is related to SDG 3, can be anything. It can also be solved by not looking at the health issue, maybe also big support programs also for health, but actually investing more in equality or in infrastructure or in poverty alleviation programs. And we need that. This is what I would call the intervention level and creating some sort of form of more smarter investment portfolio. So then we show that also in that paper, basically saying we need sort of three logics. We need to have sort of three levels of intelligence that we have to develop further. Call it the governance logic, which is largely also set up already in the international organizations as part of the support for the SDG agenda. So I'm very supportive of that. And of course, very often people would say, well, but that's hybrid governance. It's not working and there's a lot of problems there. Well, actually, I'm quite optimistic about that. There's a lot of intelligence there that informs also what I call the systems logic. So at the meso level, how to then to see how that can work, that then can also support what I would call the strategic logic. And the strategic logic is the weakest part of this. We have to develop much more insights also how to link macro, meso, and micro policies and also strategies. Of course, if I take it from the micro point of view, I would say the strategic logic for companies has to become more smarter and more supported by policy measures. So that brings me to my final slide. So the slide actually said, can multinational leads? And I just hint at a very recent Journal of International Business Policy special issue that we just issued with the title on the SDGs, can multinational enterprises lead the decade of action? So the next 9 years, with lots of interesting contributions. So I can advise everyone to look at this. So my first answer is sure, they can, because they want. But it requires further investment in hybrid governance and also custodian agencies. And I really support that, and let's see how we can make that work. It also invests in collective intelligence, like, for instance, the SDG Pulse initiative of UNCTAD. And I see so many interesting activities there. But it also means that we need to do that to share it with front-runner experience of resilient M&Es. And there is an increasing number of resilient M&Es that try to embrace the SDGs, as we call it a backcasting agenda, for present investment in sustainable development issues, like access to health, SDG 3. Never alone on that issue, but always in combination with other partners and linked to the core business, not as philanthropy, but as an investment agenda. there's lots of interesting examples there. Unfortunately, most of the websites that look at this look at so-called best practice cases. So they only want to have the positive story. And I think we need to also develop the front-runner experience in terms of problems and advantages. So that requires, call it micro research on and then the question is not only on single SDGs, but what I would call the NEXUS strategy. So wrapping up also my presentation, if we want to look more intelligent at the investment challenge of companies, and then also have a sort of a test bed of where we can have supportive micro interventions, also from a policy point of view, my position would be try to define a number of key litmus tests also. So where to put your effort in. And I have 3 of them as an advice today. I think SDG 8 and the topic of living wage, for me, would be the perfect litmus test to figure out very complex global value chains and to see what it actually means. And then, of course, we know living wage contribute also to climate change, to limiting poverty, etc. The second nexus really is SDG 5, the gender equality. We know that the spillover effects of investing in gender equality are really important, and there are some speculation that they can be even the best sort of contribution to climate change. I see that with companies that they don't look at that in that way. They look at gender equality as sort of we have diversity in the board or whatever, and that's it. There's much more to be said about that. And finally, I think one of the most important nexus, and then maybe also related to what Sariana just said, is the water, energy, food nexus. There's lots of research done that actually, if you're able to link them up also in your business model, you can have an immense impact also. In economics, of course, we call it a multiplicator effects or spillover effects. But that from the business point of view, we need more investment there and hopefully also more intelligence there. So that terminates my presentation. So please focus on the nexus.
Thank you very much, Rob. Very much appreciated. Very interesting perspective on how M&Es can lead in the sustainable recovery transition. Let me pass on immediately to our next speaker, Professor Andres Rodriguez-Pose, who takes a different perspective and looks more at industrial development and at the development perspective of sustainable recovery and investing to that end. Andres, can I pass the floor to you? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you very much to the AIB and to UNCTAD for having me here. I'm going to be sharing my screen right now. Let's see. Unfortunately, the screen that is being shared is the wrong one, but I hope you can see at least partially the slides. Let me see if I can change it now. Okay. Now it's the right one. So thank you very much. I'm going to take a different type of approach, is a more territorial approach, in which I'm going to be looking at what has been the change and how is the pandemic actually leading to a change in the, let's say, territorial organization of our countries, and how that is likely to provoke general crisis, lower differences in development, and that is going to need more policies rather than less policies, as some are predicating at the moment. Let me just start by reminding you of the situation in the pre-pandemic period, which might seem like a century ago, but it was only a year ago. And in the pre-pandemic period, what we had was several decades in which economic activity had become more and more concentrated within our countries and more concentrated in the big cities. You have a picture of Paris, but this is not something that happened in the developed world. It was happening also in many emerging countries. Far greater growth in the large metropolis, far lower growth in many intermediate and rural areas that had this transition, if you want to call it like that, significant consequences in the rise of discontent. One was discontent at the ballot box with the emergence of fringe parties, anti-system parties, the liberal parties, populist parties, whatever you want to call them, that emerged both at the extreme right and extreme left of the political spectrum. You have here some indicators from Europe, but this is by no means a European phenomenon. We have the case of the US with Donald Trump, but in emerging and developing countries, the situation that we have seen in Thailand since the mid-1990s, and that has had significant implications for the economic development of the country, but not just in Thailand, in places like Argentina, Mexico, Brazil, Russia, or even in India. So in that respect, there has been rising discontent, and the line between discontent and actually showing that discontent at the ballot box and going into outright violence is normally very thin. There's the case, I put an image there of the revolt of the yellow vest, the Gilets jaunes in France, but I could have put the torching of metro stations that happened last year, for example, well, a year and a half ago in Santiago de Chile. If we move forward to the pandemic period, this seems to be, and it has been highlighted by many as a game changer, that is going to actually redesign the way we structure our societies from a territorial perspective. The biggest impact has been across cities. Many of our cities have emptied or partially emptied during parts of the pandemic, during lengthy lockdowns, for many reasons. Why? Because first, there has been the possibility of conducting work, or increasingly there has been an acceleration in remote working and teleworking, but also because the cities, like in medieval times, in medieval pandemics, were seen as a seed of contagion. So people moved out to the countryside, they moved out to smaller cities where they could get bigger houses, they could go to the second residences and work from the comfort of their secondary homes or areas with more green space or more free space. That would also limit the risk of contagion. So in fact, this is the irony. Many people are saying, well, we have had a pandemic, and this pandemic might be solving the territorial problems of greater polarization within our countries that we were seeing before, because now we can work from anywhere in the world. And that provides a significant opportunity for the losers, the ones that were losing before, especially declining industrial areas, but also medium-sized towns and rural areas. But we have to put all this in perspective and take a look at the forces of change that the pandemic is producing. And here there are quite a few. The first one is this idea of social scarring. The idea that since the pandemic, many people have become wary of interaction. That is promoted by lengthy lockdowns. We're seeing the emergence of psychological problems and in some cases mental illness. And this is something that might stay to a certain extent after the pandemic. There have been significant changes that needed to be made to maintain social distance in the physical space of how we see our cities and our territories. So changes in our restaurants, in our workspaces, in our shopping spaces, in security at the airports, that many of them are going to stay. And probably the biggest one has been this forced social experiment, which was mainly accelerating many of the changes that we had witnessed. So going to e-work, so remote work, going to e-shopping, going to e-commerce, going to socializing, if you want, that is going to change everything that we have seen in a much more radical way. What was supposed to take about decades, if not years, if not decades, has probably happened in many parts of the world overnight as a result of the pandemic. Of these three forces, probably the social scarring and the changes to maintain social distance, I hope they're going to be short-lived, and there would be some return to normal after the end of the pandemic, depending on how long it takes. I mean, with vaccination, let's hope it's shorter than longer, but nevertheless, you never know. The forced experiment, social experiment, is going to have more significant changes. In fact, as we have seen, there has been a massive shift all over the world to shopping online, which is going to accelerate commerce in many ways. There has been a significant change towards, in many areas and in many sectors, towards remote working, and even conferencing like we're doing at the moment, socializing is becoming remote. And that has important implications for the physical space. You can see here, this is a city in England in which the main street is undergoing what Richard Florida has called a retail apocalypse. So many boarded shops abandoned fundamentally because they're no longer viable. But also there's going to be less need for office space, especially if we move not to complete remote working, but to hybrid systems in which many of us will be working remotely part of our time, whether it's 40, 50, 60%, it will depend. And also there's going to be a significant change in the way we use leisure and other type of activities. And that has implications for, in terms of the impact on geography. I mean, as I was saying at the beginning, many have said that this is a possibility. It offers opportunities for all over the world, that there's no need to concentrate working in the big cities. There's no need to go to Lagos or to go to Accra or to work from Mumbai. You can go to rural areas in those countries or to other parts of the world, provided that you have a good internet connection, you can conduct the same amount of work. And that therefore, in countries that have seen significant imbalance and growth of imbalance, which includes most developing countries, but many developed countries like the map of France I've included there, there's going to be some sort of rosy future in which many parts of the country are going to flourish, not just Paris as a result of this. Having said that, there are cities, and big cities have got a lot of pull and push factors, and they're going to be still, the pull factors are going to remain there. Because we're going to hybrid models. It's not that we're going to be able to work from a very remote area in our countries without having any access to the office. So the big cities are going to maintain that advantage of having, well, not just more office space, but better pool of workers, more capacity to generate new knowledge, and more capacity to generate. So the sort of interaction spillovers that pull and foster economic development. So it's very likely that in most parts of the world, including most of the developing world, the big cities are going to keep on just taking off as they were before. There are going to be some rural areas that might benefit, small cities, but very often they're going to be either because they have exceptional amenities and very good conditions that were already advantaged before, but also some that are in close accessibility to cities that may allow for commute. But the majority of small cities, the majority of towns, the majority of rural areas are going to continue their decline, especially because they lack many of the conditions that are needed for, let's say, remote working. In a recent study done by the OECD, what they highlighted is that looking just at OECD countries, the places where people had more sectors and there was more possibility of remote working were, surprise, surprise, the big cities. And these differences in sort of structure and worker structure are far greater in developing countries than in developed countries. So very much it's the small towns and the rural areas that might be accentuating the previous decline after the pandemic. What we're going to see is probably a bigger change within cities, in which city centers, because of less demand of office space and therefore less demand of leisure, perhaps also less demand of habitational space, are going to undergo significant transformation, becoming perhaps more office spaces of leisure, but also we're going to see is perhaps a flourishing of nearby areas, mainly in the suburbs. So what we can conclude from this is that we're not going to have a significant radical change in pre-trends. And we're going to need policies to avoid polarization, greater polarization and exacerbation of the problems that were not just economic, but were increasingly social and political problems that we were witnessing in the pre-pandemic period. They're not going to disappear. But beyond what Rob was mentioning, the sort of effort to invest in infrastructure, for example, telecommunications, etc., which was at the hub of development policies before, we need to look into other types of policies that might have a much bigger impact in trying to transform and redress the sort of imbalance that we were seeing pre-pandemic and that is going to be exacerbated post-pandemic. with much more effort on business support, mainly to avoid the sort of problems that we have seen in many parts of the world of having access to protective equipment or to vaccines that we are witnessing at the moment. Support for environment and nature that Sarianne has been highlighting, and to far greater detail that I can afford here. Much more emphasis on human resources, and especially, I would say, more emphasis on social infrastructure, and especially in areas that have been losing population in some cases, or have been losing economic dynamism in most others for now quite some time. So in the end, what we have is that the pandemic is producing challenges, but many of those challenges are going to accelerate the sort of problems we had before. And in order to redress those problems, we'll need far better policies, perhaps more policies, and policies that allow us to rebuild and rebuild better.
Thank you, Andres. Thank you very much. So with that, we move to our last presenter of this morning's session. We've seen a presentation on one of the key priorities for investment in sustainable recovery, namely the energy transition. We've looked at the impact on business models. We've now looked at this development perspective and regional development perspective. And our last presenter, Jacob Molnar, will look at the finance perspective. A lot of the priorities for investment in sustainable recovery, as you see on the title here, is going to be in infrastructure and infrastructure industries, including the energy one we saw the example of, and a lot of investment in that takes place through project finance. So we'll hear a little bit more about that now from Jacob Molnar. Jacob, can I pass the floor to you?
Yes, thank you, Richard, for the introduction. As Richard already said, Isabel and we would like to present a financial perspective on sustainable recovery, especially in developing countries. And this work is also part of the world, or will hopefully be part of the World Investment Report that will be issued later this year. And we're collaborating intensely with Richard and his team at UNCTAD in getting the data support for this financial perspective. In the report, we want to focus specifically on one area that is of particular importance for sustainable development in developing countries, and that is project finance. Because project finance is the main vehicle with which large-scale infrastructure projects are delivered to these countries that also have a long-term impact. Now, project finance from a financial perspective is very different from corporate finance in that it cannot rely on the assets of Western companies to secure the loans that are needed to implement the project. Quite the contrary, in project finance, a separate entity is established and the participants try to create a financial structure that is forward-looking. And the only thing that is available to the banks that provide up to 80% of the capital is the forecasted cash flows of the specific project. So there is no security for the banks in there, which makes project finance highly dependent on this bank market or this lending market of non-recourse debt. And there is some reason or some worries that the COVID pandemic might influence this market in a way that could threaten the sustainable recovery in developing countries. And in the World Investment Report, we start with the 1 5-way scenario, a pessimistic scenario that could happen if the project finance market is affected in a negative way. What are these 5 scenarios or these interlinked mechanisms of one pessimistic scenario? The first would be that it could lead to a redirecting of private investments into developing countries and into developed countries and away from developing countries. Why is that the case? Because developed countries are currently spending a lot on infrastructure packages and recovery packages, and this will skew the business case of projects towards these low-risk developed projects. and this will be comparatively more difficult for developing countries to do. Second, there could be a redirecting of private investment into sectors that yield lower long-term accessible development impact. For example, some sectors like transportation, aviation, education, urban transport, they have suffered much more from the public health measures that were taken during the pandemic. This threatens the stability of the projected cash flows for the future, and this could lead to a trend in which private investors are flocking towards more or less sectors with lower accessibility, such as natural resources and oil. The third and probably the most important scenario would be higher costs of financing. It has been shown in academic literature that when uncertainty is high, this affects developing countries disproportionately. And there's some research on that, and that relates to the policy risk that comes with uncertainty and to the flight home effect of private lending. And these higher costs of financing would make high impact investments into developing countries more expensive in the future and in a post-pandemic world. The fourth mechanism that could threaten sustainable recovery is that the few funds that are available in developing countries might have to be used to bail out existing projects. Because there are a lot of projects already there and delivering, hopefully, some development value, but many of those, or the cash flows of many of those, might have been reduced or negatively affected by the COVID pandemic already. Now, this will trigger the need for refinancing these projects, and in many cases, developing countries are in a very bad bargaining positions with private banks and private sponsors when it comes to that, and it could well be that developing countries will have to pick up the bill on these existing projects. And the fifth was one point that Sariana also alluded to, that when countries like the US and China are throwing a lot of money into recovery packages that include infrastructure spending, then it might lead to capacity shortages, with the high quality developers of these projects flocking more into developed countries and leaving little capacity for the less developed countries. Now, all of these 5 trends could materialize in a way that they would reduce project finance investment inflows into high impact sectors and into developing countries. But in a worst case, and that's, I think, the very important point we want to make, in the worst case, it could also create the groundwork for a worst case scenario. And that is when private lenders and private sponsors anticipate political risk in developing countries related to COVID maybe, and adjust their pricing accordingly. This is what in my finance courses or in my infrastructure finance courses, I call the self-fulfilling prophecy of cautious valuation. What happens when lenders and sponsors anticipate political risk is that they will adjust their pricing. Lenders usually charge a risk premium on top of the interest rate to the project. Equity sponsors will adjust their weighted average cost of capital to include a possible political intervention by a host government or any other sort of expropriation event, for example. Now, these metrics or these pricing metrics are essentially an unfair ex ante tax on developing countries because they pay relatively more in terms of interest and in terms of cost of capital than developed economies. And to some degree, this leads to the paradox situation where the cautious valuation of these finance experts in banks fuels social tensions and imbalance in revenue distribution to the host countries. So it fuels incentives for political opportunism, and the cautious valuation might actually lead to the fact that these developing countries then act in a way that is considered a political risk event. I see that I am approaching the end of my 8 minutes, so I will refer the audience to the World Investment Report, where we then take this 5-way pessimistic scenario to derive policy implications for developing countries. And yeah, we can also discuss them, of course, in the discussion section, but I think my time for now is over.
Thank you very much, Jacob, and very disciplined, very much appreciated. And we'll definitely try and find some time in the discussion round to go look at this in more detail. That concludes our 4 substantive presentations for this session, but we have 2 discussants who will say a few things about the presentations we have seen so far. I'd like to start with Shasha Zhao of Surrey University Business School. And I think you will focus on the first 2 presentations we heard of Sariana and Rob. Is that right, Sasha?
Yeah, that's right, Richard.
Over to you.
All right, thank you. So thank you. So my role is to discuss the first presentation. So I'm gonna discuss the first presentation and bring out a few just brief points. So there are 2 main points I'd like to discuss in the 5 minutes I've been given. So thank you first. Thank you to Sariana and Rob, which I found your presentation extremely insightful and in many ways positive about sustainable recovery. I very much agree with Sariana's point on the importance of MAEs, governments, and FDI in the renewables as important interconnecting factors that can contribute to the global energy transition. And Rob's point on having SDG-based systems logic that can act as an important mechanism connecting policymakers and firm efforts to address sustainability issues more effectively. So I won't summarize what they've talked about, but more broadly, I think I see 2 important overarching messages from their presentations. So the first one is the importance of MAEs and investments in contributing to the realization of the different but often interconnected SDGs. And second is the such a realization does require a deeper, wider, and more systematic approach to collaborations between governments and firms. So in light of these 2 important points I've gathered from their presentations, I'd like to discuss briefly a current example, which very much mirrors, their points here. And this concerns the unprecedented rise in plastic waste during the pandemic. Now, this issue has been caused by the sudden rise of global consumption of disposable PPE, as we know. But this is also because of the lack of capability and capacity to actually manage this waste effectively at the local level. Now, despite the severity of this issue worldwide, as we have observed over the last year or so, there has been very limited government or firm efforts in actually addressing it so far. So what I'm trying to highlight here, I guess, is with this COVID-led plastic waste example, is that as both Sariana and Rob noted, there should be much more extensive and systemic investment policies and efforts from governments and firms respectively, as well as in many cases, tougher regulations, I think. Efforts should really focus on, for example, in this plastic waste issue, for example, in R&D in new technologies for greener conversion of this waste into energy. So for example, in the UK, only 10% of this waste is turned into energy, despite the fact that UK is a huge importer of energy. Or R&D in terms of, and also mass production of 100% biodegradable plastic alternatives, which are becoming more available. But there is little effort from many large firms to actually replace these virgin plastics with these environmentally friendly materials. So these investment efforts, I think, can potentially lead to, in this case, for example, and also in the cases of Sarana and Rob's from their talks, is that they can have multifaceted positive effects on several interconnecting SDGs. For example, with the issue of plastics, SDG number 12 on responsible consumption, production, 13 on climate, 14 on marine life, 15, 16 on land and water, and 7 on affordable and clean energy. So that it has a much longer term effect with this particular example. Additionally, I think given that Bob and Sarana both highlighted the guiding role of governments, implying the guiding role of governments in the talks, I think it's important to call for governments of major economies and economic regions such as US, China, UK, and EU to learn best practices from each other, and also seek better collaborations in the global recovery, and move away from the politically hostile relationships that we have kind of observed during this pandemic. So that's kind of my first point I wanted to raise in relation to the presentations, but also secondly, relating to this presentation, but this webinar today, but also broadly on sustainability issue that we see, we are facing nowadays, is that but also on behalf of John Dallard, I would also like to take the opportunity to highlight what the AIB board and the community are doing in line and in support of these sustainability issues worldwide. So as many of you know, AIB's Sustainability Shared Interest Group was officially formed late last year. So this was with great support from the AIB board and just under 200 interested members from the AIB community. So the purpose of and intention of the SIG is not only about supporting academic excellence, but creating real impact on the practice of international businesses and act as a source of important information for policymakers. So I want to end my kind of, my discussions with a particular, by giving particular credit to a number of people today, including AIB President Jeremy, who has been extremely supportive of the SIG in all different ways. Rob, who just gave a presentation, Anne Cook, Jonathan Doe, Alan Berbecki, Lauren Eden, Rosalie Tong, Rudolf Sinkovich, and Dana Mibiva. So they are not only the SIG's executive advisors who have been contributing to the SIG's activities, but many of them are leading the way in publishing and editing impactful research, focusing on addressing pressing sustainability issues. And many of them are also regular advisors to influence policymaking and implementation. So in short, I want to take this opportunity to also invite AIB members to reach out to us if you want to join the SIG, if you're passionate about sustainability issues in IB. So that's a little bit of a promotion of the SIG. So thank you. That's my part of the discussion.
Thank you, Shaka.
To Pavida. Yeah, thank you, Richard. Sorry.
Thank you. I will immediately pass the floor to Pavida Paranand of Thammasat University for your comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. And thank you to AIB for having me comment on this very esteemed panelist. I'm tasked to comment on the presentation of Andre and Jacob. And rather than going into what they have already said, I think what I have seen from their both of their presentation is that they are looking at this more also from developing country perspective on the challenges facing developing countries in going forward with SDG in the post-COVID era. And with that task in mind, I think that the way I would like to look at it is that I would say that SDG is already a very tall order for the world. And if we look at the SDG from developing country perspective in the post-COVID years, I think that's an even taller order to achieve due to two factors. First is that the pandemic has created a lot of challenges for developing economies. And second, the pandemic has also led to some diverting goals among countries. And let me go into this by also referring to their presentation in this. On the first point, that the pandemic has led to increasing challenges that sometimes lead to, Jacob has mentioned that paradox, or I might call it sometimes a catch-22 in many of the development situations and issues, particularly concerning SDG. For example, take SDG 1, to reduce poverty. We all know, and Jacob has also mentioned, that more investment are needed to focus on project financing in developing countries. We know that poverty is now increased because of the COVID has led to a loss of employment in many countries, more severe in developing countries that are dependent a lot on labor-intensive work. But yet at the same time, we are seeing that financing costs are higher for projects in developing economies, partly due to their higher political risk and all those issues. So this has become a kind of a catch-22 for development when you look at how to finance projects in developing countries. Another example is if we are looking at fostering innovation, which is the SDG 9, we can see that it is becoming costly when urgent need is to contain and to cut costs in small and medium enterprises that are losing their demand and all those things. So companies that are in developing economies that have to face the task of trying to cut costs or trying to invest in more technology that could lead to their innovation, that would be a kind of a dilemma for companies with more restricted resources. Another example I can give to the challenge in developing economies is SDG 16. We have talked about peace and justice being part of the cities that Andre has pointed out, that new cities would become more like people are moving into more cities. But that perhaps is a more kind of the luxury of developed economies. When you look at developing economies, you already alluded that big cities would still continue to prosper. And we have seen that in developing economies, the extent of development into various cities would be become even more challenged under the certain political institution and increasing risk. I think I am speaking here from Bangkok, and we can see that political challenge in the region of Southeast Asia is become something of a main concern in my country, as well as in my neighboring country of Myanmar. So that's the first point on the challenges are becoming more grander and more serious. And at the same time, countries are also having diverging goals when they are looking at resilience and sustainability. And I think part of it is because the rising nationalism that has affected trade and investment activities and agendas have been something that is we have to look at. And take, for example, we talk a lot about global value chain resilience. When we look at global value chain resilience, some people might be looking at how firm can be resilient on itself. Take the Suez Canal example of how ships might want to deviate around the Cape of the Good Hope instead of just trying to wait for the Suez Canal. And at the same time, we are looking at resilience from the level of global value chain that still sees the importance of investing in overseas for efficiency. But at the same time, government is looking at resilience as a national security issue, bringing production activities more to onshore and reshoring. So all this are pointing to diverging goals among countries. So these are not easy answers to for everyone, and I don't think I have an answer for this. But I think we are seeing two trends in the world that can lead to more research into this area. First, we are seeing the top-down approach of how supranational institutions can play a more important role, as Jacob has pointed out. But I also think that my last point here is that when we look at how we address these issues, we also need to look at it from the bottom up perspective of everyone that are engaged in this. And I think the issue of complementarities of views on resilience and on sustainability will become much more important as we seek to understand what resilience or what sustainability means for different players, for host country, for home country, as well as for MNEs and for the people in emerging economies. Thank you very much. And that would be my view to share.
Thank you, Pavita. Thank you for that intervention. That brings us to the end of our scheduled speakers. We are well over the scheduled original time, but I would like to give all of our speakers the chance to answer questions posed both by our discussants and in the Q&A. There's a few questions there that you can address. And let me just go in the same order and try and pose sort of my own question, maybe as an introduction for each of you. Sariana, you had a question in the chat actually on the incentives for businesses to invest. Now, we heard during the presentations that the nature of the investments in the energy sector and in infrastructure sectors that you talked about is actually a little bit different from the usual multinational enterprise that we talk about. We heard from Jacob, it's project finance, it's banks, it's special purpose vehicles. What does that mean? Are we really talking about the same businesses that need incentives, or are we talking, and what is the implication also for IB theory that the nature of the actors in investment in this area is a little bit different?
Thank you, Richard. So on the issue of whether these are normal investors, so in some ways they are not. And I think overall in the field, we need to be more interested in these infrastructure firms and how these projects get carried out. On the other hand, when we look at, particularly now in the aviation and maritime value chains, there are what you would call normal multinationals that play a very pivotal role. So one of the pictures that I showed you was the imagined energy island in the Baltic that's actually envisioned by a company called Wärtsilä, who make marine engines and all other kinds of things for ships, and they also deliver power plants, so the equipment for power plants. And these companies, this is really the core of their business, and there's no incentives involved in it. What they have to do is to try to predict which energy options would they need to be developing on and spending their R&D money on. And what they are doing at the moment is basically trying to develop something that'll burn anything. Trying to make what they offer to their customers as flexible as possible. The issue of incentives, I'd like to address a little bit the point that Pavita was pointing to earlier, and before that, Jakob, this issue of risk and the sort of pricing of the unknowns. The question in the chat, I think, was very good from Klaus. Will this only work basically in Europe? And I'm talking about Northern Europe, so Danish energy island and Finnish companies. And in some ways, I think the answer is yes. I think this is the laboratory where we're going to see what is possible in a short time frame in creating this new kind of energy transition. What I'm hoping for is that this will actually have sort of positive externalities for the rest of the world, at least in terms of absorbing some of the cost of learning. technologically, but also in terms of how do you make it work on the systems level. But unquestionably, this is part of the inequalities that was pointed out by Andres and that was pointed out by Pavida, that there are only some parts of the world where this is going on and where these things feasibly might take off the ground. My hope is that these best practices that Shasha was also referring to can then be transferred over. But I do have a real concern about there isn't enough money, there aren't enough actors to carry out these projects, and the interest is diverted in other directions in the rest of the world. There is no question about that. But on the question of, do we need to understand these structures more? Yes, I think in part, but in part, these are actually actors that we know, and we just haven't paid enough attention to the infrastructure sectors, I think, as a whole.
Thank you, Sariana. Yes, I agree. I think there's a lot to be considered here also in terms of sort of IB theory development on this different mechanism for international investment. So I think that's an area for research. Rob,
can I add one tiny point? I know we are very short on time, but I only wanted to add the tiny point that I think really the pricing of the risk and the pricing of the unknown is so vital. Because if you ask the question of why is this working or presumably working in Finland or Denmark, when they price the risk there, I mentioned trust. So that's kind of in my mind the obverse of risk. When you have social structures and a history that happens to be beneficial in the sense that people are quite trusting and the society is small and what have you, these things are possible. The moment we step away from that, the political risk element becomes much more salient than it is in that context. Thank you. I will.
Thanks, Ariana. Thank you. Rob, you had a few questions already in the Q&A, and you have also already answered quite a few. So appreciate that. Thank you very much. Perhaps you want to say a few more things. I have one question that just would like to surprise you with. Which is we're looking at the business model and the impact of the behavior of multinational firms post pandemic, right? And during the recovery phase, what will change? And I've read some research saying that ultimately, when things go back to normal, firms will go back to normal. Their drivers and determinants of their activities will not change very much. What do you think about this?
Thanks, Richard. I think for time's sake, we have to keep it really short. So let's say I'm pessimistic and optimistic at the same time. So pessimistic because, yes, you're right. I'm looking at, for instance, airline companies. They want to cut back to normal, whatever that means, as soon as possible with heavily government support. But I see many other companies also that say, hey, our model is not resilient. So there are lots of indicators that we can develop. NEXUS is there. But Sasha also said, in terms of we look at plastic waste, for instance, well, why don't we invest in a preventive model, not in a curative model? And we look at the health issue as well. The challenge there will be, is it possible to make that preventive model or health or not going back to normal also an investment opportunity? That requires regulation. That requires support also of international organizations. And it probably also requires penalties on non-sustainable investment. So there's a bundle of things you can do if you want to sort of disincentivize companies to just go back to normal and incentivize them to go back, to go forward to what I think, and I'm talking to many CEOs of many companies, they really want to make progress. But in many respects, many of them are also sort of caught in the old business model. They're the hostage of their own success. We call it the incumbents curse. So that requires some smart also policy measures. And to be honest, I think that the SDG agenda and framework can help a lot there. But then, of course, I come back to what I just said. The Nexus challenge is the one that you have to look at. And I'm talking to businesses. There's a lot of good will, but not really very sophisticated modeling going on there. So I take it also as a responsibility of business schools, but maybe also for UNCTAD, to develop those business models in more detail. It's a research agenda as well as a policy agenda.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you very much. Andres, you also had one or two questions in the Q&A on regional development and on the implications of that. And in fact, I was wondering too, listening to your presentation, with the focused shifting to regions, right? What will that mean for investment and investment promotion, right? There is quite a bit of research saying that trying to promote investment in underdeveloped regions in a country is often not very successful or doesn't bring the desired benefits. What do you think about this? Is the shift to the regions, what's the implications for investment and especially investment promotion objectives of the shift to the regions?
Thank you very much, Richard, and I'll try to be brief. First thing is we have to bear in mind that depending on the countries, the big cities, the largest cities, the most dynamic cities where there's greater potential for growth normally represent about 1/3 of all growth. That means that 2/3 is in intermediate cities, in towns and in rural areas. Within this smaller places, there would be more dynamic and less dynamic regions. And this both in the developed and in the developing world. I would say that overlooking that sort of potential is madness. First, because there's significant economic potential there. Many of these regions were motors of economic development in our countries in the past. They continue to be so. If you take a look at the Fortune 500 companies, in fact, 96 of them, 19% of the total are located very often in small towns and cities, and many more were born in smaller towns and then moved to the big cities for a series of reasons. And therefore, there's enormous economic potential there that needs to be tapped and not left untapped, because otherwise it's a waste. The second is as important are the social and political consequences. When we are leaving places behind, what we have is significant inequality and rising inequality in many parts of the world, and that inequality brings political discontent. Looking at Pavida's comments and her country is one of the most polarized in the world. If you measure inequality in Thailand, for example, depending on the index, is territorial inequality is between 8 and 12 times what you find in the US or you will find in Australia, and much bigger than what you find in Europe. And that is creating significant social problems because it has left a lot of people behind, a large percentage of the population, but also significant political problems. That has made a country that was the most dynamic by quite some margin in the whole of Southeast Asia to one of the relative laggards. It's not that it's doing badly, but it's doing much worse than that. And when you exacerbate that and you put it on the long term, you end up with countries like Argentina, where the situation has been going on for the best of a century, since the 1920s, 1930s. And therefore, its magnificent economic potential has been undermined by the significant discontent, which has been triggered by both high interpersonal and interterritorial inequality that has led to mainstream parties and the rise of the liberal parties adopting positions that go from internal nationalism to what Pavida was saying, also rising international nationalism that might affect trade. And as we know, trade has a lot of advantages in terms of reducing poverty, both in the countries of origin of trade, but also in many of the countries of destination. Thank you.
Thank you, Andres. Moving to Jacob. I mean, Jacob, you also had a question in the Q&A about the potential for outward investment promotion agencies or export guarantee agencies to support project finance in developing countries, and that might address one of the imbalances you had in your presentation with the asymmetry between developed and developing countries in terms of the recovery packages, obviously. I would like to add another question to that, which is the huge optimism that I read about, in the current low interest rate environment where capital is nearly free. There should be a lot of this money flowing into sustainable recovery, into SDG relevant projects, into infrastructure. So this low interest rate environment, will that really be such a boon for infrastructure investment, or if I look at the risks that you present, this might not translate so much?
Well, my answer is it's again probably an asymmetric thing. In developing countries, we can assume that risks are rather low, and the same as in the interbank lending environment, the LIBOR, for example, if the LIBOR is low, low risk lending is available at very low cost. But when we move the whole playing field in developing countries, banks have to account for the risk that they might not get their money back. It's no longer an issue of how much interest do they get for the money they lend over the time they lend it. It's an issue of, do they get the money back at all? And if banks have any reason to suspect that this might be an issue, they will adjust the interest rates by just adding a risk premium on top of the risk-free interbank lending rate. And if this happens, this creates these paradox incentives. So the answer is probably low interest rates help, but only as long as the risk for your investment is low. And in project finance, the time horizons are sometimes up in 40 years. Your costs are stuck in the ground because you just can't dismantle a hospital or a transport facility and put it somewhere else. So the banks really have to look at the probability that something political might happen to the project over the course of 40 years. And in this environment, it's no longer a question of, is the LIBOR banking rate at the moment 1% or 0%? It's, do they get the money out of the country if they have to at all?
Great, thanks, Jacob. About the point for the outward investment promotion agencies or export credit agencies, anything?
I did respond to that in the chat as well. My opinion here is that in the short term, these agencies provided a lot of relief, and they were part of the reason why project finance remained relatively stable compared to corporate finance, so compared to corporate FDI. So it was lower decreases than corporate FDI, but this is just a short-term mechanism. And in the long term, if you want to solve developing countries' problems, a lot more effort must be put in place than export credit agencies can provide. And this can only be achieved if we attract sufficient private debt and sufficient private equity to join these efforts.
Great, thank you very much. We have actually gone over the time allocated for the session. I would just, before I wrap up, ask our panelists if there's any question left in the Q&A that they would still like to address. Otherwise, I will move to wrap up the session. No, everyone okay with this? Thank you all so much for very interesting presentations. Very much appreciated. I think overall there's a couple of some very good takeaways from this. The fact that investing in sustainable recovery is, I think, a very varied topic. I mean, there's many different angles to this. I think Pavida made a very good comment, explaining, even just looking at the concept of resilience, that there is so many different aspects to this. You can look at a country's economic and social resilience, and companies, they look at supply chain resilience. So there's many aspects to looking even at just the aspect of investing in greater resilience post-pandemic. There's also many aspects of looking at or many perspectives in terms of looking at what sustainable recovery priorities should be. There is the state perspective or the public perspective, policy perspective, the perspectives from the different countries that come at this from different angles. Developing countries will have a very different perspective. But there's also the company perspective on what sustainable recovery means for them, as we heard from Rob on the business models. And then there is, what are the many different priorities we need to look at? I really appreciated the deep dive on the energy transition, but there are many other different types of investment that we need to promote sustainable recovery. For me, the overarching point is how much scope there is for research on this by UNCTAD, by AIB, and in collaboration. Because I think that many of the points we heard today are really something that, to me, bring new perspectives, especially the fact that these investments in infrastructure look so different from an organizational, institutional, and actors' perspective, and therefore many of the topics we normally work on in international business research on global value chains and the behavior, the drivers and determinants of investments of multinational enterprises are going to be quite different from what we are used to. So I think a lot of scope to come up with a renewed agenda for research on this. And for that, thank you all very much to the speakers this morning. And I look forward to another interesting presentation this afternoon. Jeremy, do I hand back to you to close?
Well, you can do, Richard. You've done a great job, and all of our speakers have done a fantastic job also. Thank you very much, all of you, for coming and sharing your insights with us. I've taken a lot of notes. I won't be able to say or to do them justice this afternoon when James and then I have the opportunity to reflect in our concluding statements. But you've given us a lot of wonderful ideas, and I'm sure that James will be picking up on those this afternoon. Thank you again. Thank you, Richard, for anchoring this so excellently. I found the discussants very stimulating, and the speakers speak for themselves. I think it was absolutely enlightening, and I've learned a lot, and everything we learned today, this morning for me, fits together as part of a picture. And I think we can genuinely see that the Academy of International Business is going to be able to contribute to helping make this picture more integrated and more sustainable, and working with UNCTAD, Richard, and I think in the future, looking forward to a very rewarding partnership. So thank you for getting it started in such a wonderful way, to all of our speakers, our discussants, to James and to Richard. And thank you again. I'll say bye-bye for now and see you this afternoon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Jeremy.
Thank you, James.